Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on getting started with digital accessibility. We'll be looking at what accessibility is, why it matters, and how you can get underway. My name is Andrew Levey. I'm Head of Product Marketing here at Lumar. Just before we get started, I just wanted to make everyone aware that we do have closed captioning available for this webinar. So you should have the closed captions icon at the bottom of the screen. And if that doesn't appear, you might need to click on the More icon, which is like 3 dots. First of all, and then from that closed caption icon, you should be able to choose to view the subtitles or view the live transcript. We'll also be sending a recording of the webinar in a few days' time, which will also make sure it's got subtitles included as well. So hopefully that's good with everyone there. So I've got 2 special guests with me for the webinar today who are going to delve into the topic of digital accessibility. We've got Gryff Coates, who's an accessibility advocate and software engineer at Skyscanner. He's part of a team helping attract new users to Skyscanner using SEO. He's also got a love of travel and is an accessible user. So his aim is to make travel accessible to all. We've also got Clyde Valentine with us today, who's head of growth at accessibility consulting firm QualityLogic, and focuses a lot of his time helping consult with organizations on how to build accessibility best practices into their business. So we're looking forward to a great session with those 2 today. Just in terms of the agenda, I've got a couple of housekeeping points that we need to cover, and then we'll get into the main event. Gryff's going to walk us through what accessibility is and why it should matter to you. And then Clyde is going to look at where to start and how it can be measured. We've then got a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. And we've got a few little small polls to run during the webinar, so do watch out for those as well. So yeah, just a few housekeeping points before we get started. At the bottom of the Zoom screen, you should see a Q&A box. If you do have any questions as we go through the content, please do type them into that box so that we can make sure everything is captured and recorded in the same place. We're going to cover as many questions as we can at the end of the webinar. But if there are any we don't have time for today, or if we need to get some more information to give you a fuller answer, then we'll follow up with you after the webinar. There is also a short survey at the end of the webinar, which should take less than a minute to complete. Please do fill that out if you can, because all of that feedback helps us define our future webinar program and helps make improvements to these sessions as well. And then finally, we will be recording the webinar, so we'll share the recording with you in the next few days, so you can review that at a later date, or share with your colleagues who maybe couldn't attend today. And as already mentioned, the recording will have subtitles available as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Gryff from Skyscanner, who's going to introduce our first poll and then get into the content. Gryff, over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Andrew. So before I kind of get into what is accessibility and why it matters, I just want to ask this question to get a general idea of what people think disability is and what accessibility is. So the question I'm asking here is, who do you think is disabled here? Is it A, B, or neither? So I would just like to ask that question and see what people think. So we'll just give that like 30 or 40 seconds. Great. So just give it a few more seconds to see. I don't know how many's come in, but yeah, so let's have a look at the results. So yeah, we got a good varied mix here. So we had, 52% people put A, 26% of people put B, and 48% rightly said neither. And the reason why it's neither, when we actually look at this, and this is what we'll come into when we talk about accessibility, is the person in A has a ramp, so they're not actually disabled. They are able to use their wheelchair to get into access, as well as B, being able to walk up some stairs. So, when we're actually looking at this, we're thinking of A as like, a person in a wheelchair going up a ramp, and they're able to, get there, and B, they're able to walk up that. So we can both say that neither is actually disabled in this instance. So yeah, next slide, please. So let's talk about what accessibility actually is. And I've kind of paraphrased the UN's charter in this, which they give to member states. And they give a really good overview of what to say. But I've kind of paraphrased it down into a condensed sentence that I kind of like to say. And that it enables people to live independently and participate fully in all aspects of life, ensuring that people have equal access to physical environment, information, and communications. So what that basically means is accessibility allows people to live independently and, you know, live full lives. They don't have any barriers to being able to access, like, you know, going into a shop or accessing a website, or how we communicate with each other, you know, how we actually communicate in written form, as well as, you know, video, as well as, you know, and when we talk about digital accessibility, we're mostly talking about websites and information here, and how that can access that. So it's really important when we think of accessibility, it's not about, like, you know, someone who's disabled or not. It's more about how we can allow everyone access to digital content. And that could be, you know, different varied types of people in life. But the main focus is generally on, you know, disability, because they get disabled by content, rather than, you know, other people that may have an inconvenience when actually accessing content. So next slide, please. Perfect. So when we talk about types of disablement, when we talk about accessibility, what is actually the disablement that we want to try and help? And there's actually 3 different types that I feel we can identify in terms of accessibility. We can have permanent disabilities, temporary disabilities, and situational impairments. So when I'm talking about permanent disabilities, I'm talking about long-term conditions that are not curable, and generally medically treatable, or, you know, generally have an outlook in life of, you know, they have a disablement to some kind of outcome of life. And there's 2 ways to think about this. The first, which is the most common, is medically disabled. And the second one, which is probably the better one, is disabled by society. So when we talk about being medically disabled, what we actually mean by that is you have a diagnosis for a disability and it's looked as a medical issue. So if you have autism, it's diagnosed as autism, and it's up to yourself to really help yourself become and fit into society. If you have, you know, an amputee, you should get medical apparatus, so that allows you to get in to, you know, a general society. It's up to you as an individual. Whereas when you actually think about disabled by society, what that basically means is, like, say if you're a visual impaired user and you can't get access to a website or something like that, it's the website that's disabling you, not yourself. It's not you has, you know, the issue by being disabled. It's because that website hasn't actually catered to you as a disabled person, thus disabling you. And it's really good to think about that in terms of accessibility, because, you know, we as a society need to adapt to allow, you know, people with disabilities to allow to use our products, not the other way around, where we should expect them to have the software to allow them to do that. And there is software that allows, like, screen readers and stuff like that for visual impairments, or, you know, a wheelchair for someone with physical impairment. But it's good to think of it that way. The second type is temporary disabilities. So these could be things like broken arms, broken legs. You know, cataracts is a really good example. You know, it's very curable in the Western world. You know, short, you know, illnesses or diseases and stuff like that over time can get better. Long COVID is a classic one at the moment. You know, they're temporary, but they will not last a lifetime. They'll be curable. And accessibility is just important for these factors as well. You know, we want to look at, like, how we can make that accessible. And the third type is situational impairments, where you could be a new parent holding a child, you could be in a low light setting, or a high, you know, a really bright setting where a screen is really hard to read contrast and stuff like that. And that, you know, has a knock-on effect for your product as well. So, and, you know, it could be things like language, where you're in a different country on holiday, and you're not able to access a site because it doesn't have a translation or localization. Those are really, really good examples of situation impairment. And with those 3 in mind, you can start thinking about how you can make things accessible, which Clyde will go on to later. Next slide, please. So when we actually think about accessibility with that in mind, there's 3 good things that I kind of like to think about. And one is, you know, there is no true or false in accessibility. There's no 100% or 0% accessible. Every single, you know, company or anything like that is never going to be fully accessible. But what you can do is try and get more and more to being better. And in the case of Skyscanner, we've got a big initiative at the moment to drive accessibility, but it's a long journey and we're not there. Rome wasn't built in a day, and we'll never really truly be accessible, but we can try and, you know, meet the goals of what we want to be accessible, and try and get as many, you know, of our travelers, which we call them, able to use our site from different rounds of life, you know, who may be visually impaired, which is a big driver at the moment for us. The other thing is the goal is to create accessibility for all, as I said there. So we want to make sure that we're building digital content that is available for all and accessible for all. And there's ways and tools that you can do that, but that always should be your overall game. You shouldn't concentrate solely on one type of user and not another, or you shouldn't concentrate on external customers and forget about your internal accessibility, which is a really good thing. So the goal should be creating accessibility for all, not just for a niche select thing. And the other thing, as I kind of related to there, it's really wide ranging. There's many different types of disabilities that have very different nuances and problems that need help with. And you have like physical disabilities, like visual disabilities, cognitive disabilities, and among many others. Like you could be neurodiverse, which is very different from being a visually impaired user, and have very different subset of problems. So it's good to think of it in that kind of wide ranging arch. So yeah, next slide, please. So why should it matter to you as a company? Why should you really start caring about accessibility? And I've kind of put this into 4 different realms, which I think why it should be important and why it should be taken seriously. And the first one, which is the one that's probably quoted the most along with legal, is the moral aspect for it. It's the right thing to do. I'm an accessible user. I sometimes use screen readers because I find it hard to read and write. I can actually generally use visual impaired ones because I find it easier, like VoiceOver. But I also, it's just the right thing to do in society. We want to make sure that society is an equal place and an equal playing field. And as part of, diversity, inclusion, equity, we want to make sure that we include as many people as we can. And it's just sometimes the right moral thing to do. The second one, which is the one that most companies concentrate on, is the legal ramifications. In the UK, you've got the Equalities Act 2010. In America's with Disability Act. And in Europe, you've just had the European Accessibility Acts just come in. And all of those laws basically mean that there's a requirement for you to be accessible, and most of them for digital content go under the WCAG guidelines 2.1, which Clyde will go into probably later. But those mean that if you don't follow them, some of them have unlimited fines, and it basically means that you can actually, without even realizing it, end up with a very bad, publicity and very bad financial, things that can happen out of that. The third one, and this one, some people may find controversial, but I think is very important, is the promotional aspect of it. So I know a blind user who swears by EasyJet because it's so good for screen readers, but they propagate that out to everyone else. It's a very big thing that, it will make a huge PR wave of people saying that, because if a blind user talks to their friends and their friends propagate out saying, oh, it's really accessible, by the way, my friend can use it, who's Addy, by the way, is able to use it and do that things, they will actually be able to, make accessible content and do that. So that's really good. And also from an internal standpoint, you have your employees, again, going back to that moral side of it, feeling good and feeling really absorbed in the culture and feeling like they're doing something, in the work they do, which means that you're more likely to retain staff, which is a really important thing these days with shortage in some sectors of staff. But finally, and I think is actually one of the most important ones, is the financial side of things. And this is for 2 reasons. One, because the UN say around about 1 in 5 people have a disability, and around about half of those have an actual accessibility need in digital content, give or take a few, percentage. But the thing about it is that means that there's a whole market that if you're not accessible, you are completely missing out on. And that's quite a big margin that you can have there, that can make the difference between you and your competitor, in terms of how you make your gains. And just by making some simple changes to a website, for example, you can actually make it far more accessible and retain far more customers or businesses in doing that. And that doesn't only go for, customer facing, it goes for business facing, because there are businesses out there that, hire, staff with accessible needs, and they need to access that content. They're not able to access from you, they might go to elsewhere. And same with, your actual website, if you're selling like a product in there, you have the same problem. But the second aspect that I think is really important as well is when you actually think of, how people with disabilities want to be viewed in life, they want to be on an equal footing as most other people. And the easiest way to do that is just take my money and give me the product that I want. And I think that's super important to think about, because, the product that I need as a neurodiverse user, and the product that a person with, visual impairment or physical disability needs is different from what, a person who doesn't have those disability needs. So when we're actually thinking about that, the best moral thing you can do, going back to the first one, is just treat them like a commodity and give them the product they want. So that's a really important aspect to think about. So yeah, that's why it should matter. I think I'm going to hand over to Andrew now, who will do another poll, and then Clyde. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much for that, Gryff. Yes, as Gryff mentioned, we just wanted to run our second poll question for today. So this time we're looking at whether your business currently implements digital accessibility practices on your website. So we'll just get that poll launched. Should pop up on your screen, and then you've got 3 options. So yes, no, or don't know, and we'll give you a few seconds there just to fill in that, and we'll get an idea of the responses in the room. Yeah, we'll just give that a few more seconds. Just start to see as people fill in, and then we should get the results pop up in a second. Here we go. So yeah, majority of people seem to do have accessibility practices on the website for the organization, which is great to hear. A few that haven't started yet, and a few unknowns. So yeah, hopefully, obviously, we're going to bring you in a minute, Clyde, and Clyde can give you some hints and tips on how to get started if you haven't already, or some benefits that you might be able to use to continue your work in that way. Just before I do bring in Clyde, I just also wanted to remind people we do have the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom. So yeah, if you do have any questions that are coming up, please do pop those into that box so that we can get those answered at the end. But yeah, without further ado, Clyde, I'll hand over to yourself.
Yeah, hey, thank you. And no, I think it's great to see that, certainly a majority of the people listening to this webinar do have some form of accessibility practice implemented in their website. That's great. And then obviously, we're always focused on how we can do better. But yeah, for this, Gryff, I think, went into some really good reasons as to why accessibility is important and how it impacts everyone. And that's whether you're in leadership or, directly working on your organization's, website and products. Where I think there is still a lot of mystery, especially if you're newer, is how to, for a lot of people, how to actually get started with accessibility, and then, more than that, to sustain the progress at an organizational level. So, what I'd like to share with everyone tuning in here is really some of the key ideas, in my opinion, for how to actually effectively address these topics. So I think we can flip to fantastic. When it comes to getting started, the thing that I always recommend to people is, simply put, just get started. I think a lot of people tend to get bogged down with all of the information that's out there on accessibility. There's a bit of a, analysis paralysis that tends to go on, and, it prevents people from making progress. So I think it's important, really for anyone, whether you're leading a team or directly working on, your website, or your content, or, whatever it is, just dive in, look up some accessibility best practices and then actually implement them. Work on this, iterate it over time. The thing I always go back to is accessibility isn't about being perfect. It's about making progress. So the idea here is, get started now, implement a little bit, and then start to build your knowledge and skills over time. I think that's a really effective way to, to start making progress. The second thing that I think is so key is actually get out there and talk to real people who experience physical or cognitive impairments, and start to build your understanding, whether that's, meeting with people internal, like inside of your organization, or people outside of your organization. That can be like your users or people in the community, or even, go through and read, threads and forums on like LinkedIn and Quora and Reddit and what have you. And bear in mind as well, like, everybody's experiences are different. And that's also why I think it's so critical to actually get an understanding of people's like life, situations and their experiences. And that way, when you go to, develop, your next product or code or build out your content or what have you, you're going to be doing so thinking of those people and operating with accessibility in mind, as opposed to just like memorizing rote rules. Like that real human connection, familiarity, empathy, understanding. I think all of that is like so critical to really being able to get into accessibility and incorporate that into your work. So those are like the two starting points I always share with people. Going a little bit further than that, I like to recommend that people run an accessibility scan on their website or their content. Automated tools don't catch everything. Accessibility is very much subjective because it's dealing with, obviously human experience, but what running an accessibility scan can do is give you exposure to some of the common issues that might be popping up, and it gets you introduced to the basics. Going further than that, you can also partner with, and this is kind of the fourth key idea here, is actually working with a professional accessibility auditor. And these organizations typically, like ourselves, by the way, but typically engage real users in supplying feedback and gets you that deeper level of understanding. And so that can help you identify in a more comprehensive way, the gaps that might exist and some of the really critical accessibility issues kind of on a whole. That, in my opinion, gives you a good foundation to build from. And then fifth key idea, that I've got listed down here is actually go through the process of trying to remediate issues. It's not trivial. It does force you and your team to develop new skills and think about tackling design, coding, content problems in different ways than you're used to. But yeah, really going through and going on the journey of remediating issues is, a great and indispensable teacher. So nothing's going to really develop your skills and knowledge more than like the application, of that. So that's one thing I think is like really, really important. And then kind of the last point here I have on just how to get started is, in my experience, I have found that the accessibility community is very welcoming and open to people who want to do better with accessibility. There are so many people that are, ready to dive in and help, who are happy to have conversations. There are great organizations and resources out there in the form of like, Web Accessibility in Mind, Web AIM, W3C. There are so many resources out there. So you're not in this alone. There's a community here behind you and here to support you. So I recommend networking with other professionals in your industry, looking at these great resources and really leaning on that to be more successful, because there's a lot of people that are happy to help. So those are some of the key ideas around the getting started piece. The trickier part of this, and this speaks more to management and to leadership, is how to get your organization aligned with accessibility. And I think we can flip over. It's one thing to work on, accessibility informally, and that's great to start. But how do you then build momentum? How do you sustain that progress? How do you measure your efforts over time? There are a lot of webinars out there on this, a lot of blog topics, all sorts of things. But what I've tried to do here is just really distill it into what I think the most critical elements are. The first thing is to really set a clear policy and standard around accessibility. It's kind of common sense, but it's hard to know how you're doing or even what you should be doing if you don't have a target to shoot for. So what I typically recommend is agreeing on a technical standard that your organization and products can be held to. The most well-known, industry standard, well-recognized standard for accessibility is WCAG. The industry standard version of that is WCAG 2.1 AA. So what I personally recommend is, to the clients that I work with, is using that as the standard to shoot for. But, different organizations have different goals, different technologies, different users, different geographies, that sort of a thing. And that's fine. So your goals may differ, but the most important thing here is getting clear on what you're trying to achieve. Now, this assumes, by the way, that you already have organizational buy-in for accessibility. And if you don't, then what you need to do is start educating, your team and your colleagues on the importance of accessibility. And that's where Gryff's points really start to come into play here. So it's all about building that business case and support for accessibility. But once you're there, kick it off by agreeing on like what your standard for success is. The next aspect that I think is like really important is giving somebody formal responsibility for the accessibility initiative. Without an internal leader, and champion for accessibility, there's no accountability and therefore no consistent progress. So actually making this somebody's job is quite important. And ideally that's somebody that, their core focus is accessibility. So that could be like an accessibility manager with executive sponsorship and support. That could be like a chief accessibility officer, VP or director of accessibility or what have you. But even without that, I've seen a lot of success placing that responsibility with, design, engineering, marketing, diversity leaders, what have you. The most important and impactful thing here is, ensuring that you're placing that responsibility with the person who has like the greatest impact and responsibility for the content and the products that ultimately reach your users. So core idea, make sure that one person is ultimately accountable for accessibility. Moving on from that, I recommend that you incorporate accessibility into every step of your software development lifecycle or your content development lifecycle. Where organizations lose like a lot of time and money is trying to retrofit, fix accessibility issues after everything is already done. And that can get ugly pretty quickly. Usually at that point, accessibility issues have been repeated, various components might need to be refactored. And, everybody, unless you're like a brand new organization or you're launching a new product, every organization does start here. But the important part is to transition to something more sustainable. So that's where I recommend, for your designers, have their designs checked for accessibility, have them leveraging accessible design libraries, have developers performing desk checks of their work, have QA performing accessibility testing or engage some kind of accessibility testing function in your business. However you go about managing it, it's important to incorporate accessibility into each leg of the journey. And that way you're going to catch issues early, and it's going to be much more sustainable. You will, be able to achieve your accessibility goals much more effectively. It'll be less time consuming, more cost effective, all of those things. And, the added benefit of that, which sometimes goes unnoticed, at least initially when you're planning this out, is when you bring that accountability for accessibility to your team, they then start to learn and develop the skill set to build with accessibility in mind. And when that happens, again, you're going to see fewer issues out the other side for accessibility, which means, again, the whole sustainability of the accessibility operation goes way up. So that is something that I think is instrumental. Speaking of teams, point number 4 is equip your teams with the right resources. I mean, that can be training, that can come in the form of, like Lumar's platform to do accessibility scanning for issues at scale or monitoring issues over time. That could be a partner like QualityLogic actually performing auditing and consulting and like testing capabilities. That can also be like job aids or checklists or, resources to just help your team implement accessibility best practices more consistently. Regardless, it's great to agree that, accessibility should be included, but make sure that you're providing your teams with the right support to be successful. So that sometimes does get forgotten. Once the groundwork here is done, organizations tend to move, and where I recommend you move is into more of like an iterative cycle. And the first part of that equation is actually monitoring and tracking your progress with accessibility. That loops full circle back to the idea of having a clear, technical standard to shoot for in the first place. People can go, hog wild with all sorts of metrics and fancy things, and you can get really sophisticated really quickly. But the thing that I, always like to bring it back to is, if you have a clear technical standard that you're shooting for, when you go through your testing, you're going to uncover what issues bring you out of, compliance or what accessibility issues exist. The thing that I always like to track as a key metric, especially if you're starting out, right, is reduction of those accessibility issues over time. As you get to a state where, your production version of your website, your product is much more accessible, then you start tracking the reduction of those issues in the actual pre-prod pipeline. And so by doing that, you can kind of gauge the efficiency of your teams. But again, the goal here is like make sure that accessibility issues are getting reduced and taken care of, and you are meeting your compliance goals. The second thing, like I would say is required, is always have a pathway for users to get in touch with you if there are accessibility issues. And one of the metrics you can throw at that is tracking the reduction of accessibility complaints over time. Like, I think that's a really important thing. So again, you can go pretty crazy with the statistics that you throw out there, but yeah, having really tracking the reduction of accessibility issues and reduction of accessibility related complaints, I think are great ways to start, like just tracking your progress. Beyond that, I have 2 points broken out for this. They're very closely related, but one of them is about the mentality that you operate with, and the second thing is about what you do with that mentality. So the mentality part is accessibility. It's not a one-time fix. It's not something that you do once and then you're done and you forget about it. Like you don't stop proofreading your work. You don't stop testing your code. In the same way, accessibility is a key quality of your website. And so, or your product or whatever it is that you're making, it is a key quality. So this is something that, requires continual attention. And, like everyone, accessibility is, accessibility is an area that is continuing to advance as well as we understand like different types of conditions and technology advances and that sort of thing. So, it's important to treat this again, not as a one-time fix, but as something that you are going to continue to learn about and make progress on and manage over time. So that's the key mentality here. Now, once people are on board with the perspective that accessibility is ongoing, and this is why I break it out into a second point, the question is, well, what do you do with that? Okay, I agree, accessibility is ongoing. What should I do? The classic saying is a failure to plan is a plan to fail. And I think that's really true here. Because technology is evolving, because standards are changing, because we're, understanding more and more about different types of life circumstances and accommodations and assistive technologies, so on and so forth. It's important to keep informed and then to also to continue to make progress. So I recommend that any organization adopting an accessibility program not only worries about the present, but also plans for how to keep themselves informed and improving going into the future. So that can be, again, following some of those great organizations like WebAIM and W3C. There are industry events like Access U is going on right now. That's a very popular accessibility conference. For those who don't attend, I recommend that you do. Following industry professionals and just tracking kind of the evolution of this over time, as well as working with your team to make sure that you're continuing to refine and make improvements to accessibility. So, I think having a plan to keep improving and keep yourself informed and your team informed, I think is absolutely critical to being successful. And with that, those are some of the, key ways, in my opinion, to get started with accessibility and to actually tackle, organizational change. So for everyone that's listening, I wish you all luck with your accessibility journeys. And I think from here we have a poll question and then can open it up to Q&A. So there you go.
Great. Thank you very much, Clyde. Yes, as Clyde said, we have just got one final poll question to wrap up before we get into the Q&A. We've had a couple of questions come in, but if you do have any others, then do just pop them into that Q&A box at the bottom of the screen there. Third poll question, really asking about whether or not you've got a dedicated accessibility tool in place for conducting audits and improving accessibility. So we'll just get that one launched. Pretty simple answers here: yes, no, don't know again. Yes, be great to see where you're at in terms of which tools you might have in place, or whether you've got a tool in place, I should say. We'll give that a few seconds for people to answer, and then we'll get the results, and then we'll head into the Q&A. Excuse me. Okay, we'll just give it a few more seconds, and then we'll get the responses through. Okay. Here we go. So, a few people seem to have a dedicated accessibility tool in place, about 20%. 57% don't have anything in place as yet, and there's a few that don't know there. So there are obviously various options of tools available. Really depends on kind of probably your type of organization, your size of organization, where you're at in your journey, which ones are going to be the best for you. I know we did actually have a question come through for that, and I've replied to them privately just to say we'll get a bit more information about where you're at in your accessibility journey, and then we can hopefully give you a better answer than we can give right now. But yes, great, thank you for that. Good to see that some of you already got some tools in place for that. So we have had a few questions in, so we'll get on to those right now. Let me just pull up the panel. Okay, so first question then, how does your company implement accessibility at Skyscanner or QualityLogic? So maybe let's come to you, Gryff, first. We'll talk to you from the Skyscanner perspective.
Yeah, so thank you. So we basically have an accessibility lead, Heather Hepburn, who leads our charge for accessibility. And from that, we basically have set principles, guidelines, frameworks that we work with. Like we have a software delivery handbook, which dictates where things should be thought about. Like, for example, accessibility should be thought about before we actually produce anything, even before the design. We will have like an expression design review, and that will cater to what users do we need to cater to? Is there any problems or anything like that? Anything that we need to be aware of? And then it kind of propagates throughout the company. And then we have a series of champion pods. Like we have an internal one, we have an engineering one, we have a user one, and we have a design product one. And they basically, each one of those will, try and propagate out ideas and planning around accessibility and how we propagate it. And then in each kind of department, we call them tribes. We have subject matter experts who are accountable for accessibility, and they will, make sure that those principles and frameworks and everything like that are aligned by checking in with teams, looking for issues. And we have a series of automated tools and suites and metrics that we base all our accessibility on. So then we have visibility. It's a journey that we're still learning, and it's something that we've been doing for about 4 years now. But there's still a bit of way to go and a bit of learning. But the main thing about it is making sure that it comes from the bottom up rather than the top down. So we don't really want senior managers saying accessibility thing, pushing it down. We want people at the bottom propagating it up and making sure that they're abiding by principles and frameworks. And that's the main thing at all levels. So yeah, that's kind of how we implement it.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Clyde, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, absolutely. So within our organization, and I'll draw one distinction here. So we're a consultancy and a services company. We don't produce software products or anything like that. So our approach to accessibility is going to be a little bit different, as the extent of the complexity of our digital footprint, if you will, is our website and for example, the proposals that we share with customers, the PDF documents that we use internally, our, time tracking system, things of that nature. It tends to be what we're primarily dealing with here. But for our organization, I mean, we very much believe in, practicing what we preach. So, yeah. Like with Skyscanner and Gryff, with anything that we develop, we consider accessibility before we actually go ahead and design, documentation or what have you. Anything that is moved toward publishment, whether it is a web page or web application or a PDF document, internal or external, goes through accessibility checks to make sure that individuals with various types of assistive technology needs are able to access that, and that that is really, really important in our organization because a significant number of our own internal employees are vision impaired or deaf or experience other types of life circumstances. And so and that's and not only that, because we are an accessibility consultancy, we believe that the perspectives of individuals with those experiences is particularly more valuable, in a lot of cases for accessibility because they're providing that real user feedback. And so there are a lot of people internally that have those needs. Those needs inevitably get drawn out in the processes that we do on just a day-to-day basis. I would say as well, our organization, not only do we have accessibility at kind of the grassroots level, there is, accessibility representation in leadership as well. Like our director of engineering is vision impaired himself. Our, director of finance is deaf, and so we have like different, different perspectives there. I think the big thing is we believe that those like unique perspectives and unique experiences make us stronger as well. And when we get to combine those perspectives and build, inclusively, you get to meet a greater range of audiences, you get to build more usable products, more usable software, etc. So that's like, and that's speaking more to the cultural side of things, but that's where we're coming from that perspective. Most of the work that we end up doing is primarily around helping organizations actually implement accessibility processes to their software delivery mechanisms. So that's where maybe a lot of the very intricate stuff gets in. But yeah, like Gryff, everything is like reviewed for accessibility, thought of in advance, and then we have pretty strong representation throughout our organization. So yeah, there you go.
Thanks, Clyde. Possibly a quick one here. What accessibility standards should we comply with? Clyde, I'll come to you for that one.
Yeah, sure. Common question. The answer I always give is it depends. Inevitably, organizations are going to have different goals, objectives, requirements, for accessibility. And it's a deeper topic, and I think we even have some help guides or some resources that are going to be shared kind of at the end of the webinar for this. But in the US, if you're just looking for legal compliance with, Americans with Disabilities Act and that sort of a thing, WCAG 2.0 AA is like the common law standard that most of the lawsuits are pointing to. So that's kind of the standard there. I always go toward the industry standard of 2.1 AA, so I tend to recommend that. Depending on your use case, and you'd know more about this as a business, but we're seeing a lot of accessibility requirements built into not just government contracts, but you think about the big tech organizations that are procuring technology. They have also started to implement their own accessibility requirements into those contracts. So you may have, in addition to some of the legal requirements that exist in your particular geography, you may have additional requirements on your organization if you want to be selling into government, higher ed, large tech organizations, what have you. So that can also have a bearing there. So the answer to that question ultimately is it depends. Most of the laws out there point to WCAG, so I think that's always a good starting point. 2.1 AA is the industry standard, so I almost always go for that. Is like, if you're going to set a standard as kind of a baseline policy, go there, and then double check what contractual obligations you might have, as that may add some additional things. So that's my 2 cents. Yeah, there you go.
Thank you very much. We're nearly at time. There is one other question that's just come in, which I think might be quite interesting. So maybe we can just cover this quickly. Maybe Gryff, you could comment on this one. And that's how do you differentiate between physical and cognitive disabilities when it comes to accessibility?
Yeah, so bearing in mind that we're a digital company, that we most of the content we produce is digital. However, the way you kind of differentiate between it is, for me, is looking at the problem set that you have. So, in terms of like physical disabilities, our main problem set that we will look at is like, amputees or people that have physical disabilities that mean that they're not able to use normal peripherals, things like keyboards or mouses, and we like how they navigate and how they use that. And then a cognitive disability may be more aspect of design, in terms of like neurodiversity, white space is important, letter sizing, being able to increase sizing and stuff like that becomes more important. Or, there might be a combination of the both where, like, for example, we introduced a security feature where you had to hold something down, and then once a bar moved, you would get past that. So instead of having like the normal kind of block protection, we did that. But the problem with that is if you're visually impaired, you can't see it. But if you've got a physical disability where you can't hold the button, you're going to have the same problem. So, but the main thing, kind of going on what Clive said before as well, main way that you kind of deal with it is using in digital accessibility, using the WCAG principles. But the other thing which the WCAG 3.0 is going to bring in is user testing and talk to users what their needs are. Because we could try and cater to physical disabilities, we could try and cater to cognitive disabilities. But the people who have the best idea to that and how to cater to that and deal with that problem are the users themselves. And we try and involve them as much as possible where our budgets allow, to be able to gauge what their needs are and what they need to do to access the website. So the short answer really is we don't differentiate it. We deal with the problems that come to us and try and deal with those as a whole, essentially. So
okay, thank you very much. We are at time. So we're going to bring an end to the session now. Just to cover off quickly, if you would like some more information, QualityLogic have got a great digital accessibility starter kit on their website, so you can find that there. You'll also find some more content on our blog, and we'll have some more content coming in the next couple of weeks, so do check back in a few weeks on that. And if you'd like to find out more about the Lumar platform, then obviously you can request a demo on our website as well. So yeah, just to wrap up, just wanted to thank Gryff and Clyde again for your presentations today. That's been really interesting, and I'm sure people have found some really great insights and ways to get started. So thank you very much for your content, and thank you everyone for joining us, and have a great rest of your week, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.